Race fans, it's time to buckle in and listen to the fastest hour in racing radio. Your driver is a multi-time NASCAR winner and Hall of Famer Mark Martin. We cover racing, grassroots, history, we bench race, we talk life, and most importantly, we smash the loud pedal. It's time to turn some laps on the Mark Martin Podcast.
Episode number 32 of the Mark Martin Podcast, and today we're going to get to some questions. We've gone up to 1990. But we're going to take a stop and pause, and we're going to answer some in-depth questions that race fans have from those years. But before we do that, make sure to head over to the website, markmartinpod.com, markmartinpod.com, and listen to the old episodes. Subscribe on your favorite player. And again, leave us that 5-star rating. But Mark, we're going to have some fun today. We're going to do some fan questions.
Yeah, look forward to it.
So we got some questions coming in on the Twitter, and also we have some email questions that we're going to get into. But Mark, we're going to start with a question that you pointed out. It was on Twitter from @Daniel Aldrich. Now, Daniel, he went kind of hardcore and asked a lot of questions here, which is super cool. We're gonna touch on a couple of those questions. But the biggest one that stood out to you, his question: after you left Batesville and you kind of broke away from your dad as far as quote racing goes, you bring him up occasionally where he helped a little here and there. You weren't happy with his lifestyle choices at the time. At what point did that turn and improve with you guys?
Okay, so this really refers to March of '79 when I loaded up the truck and trailer in our little race car and headed for Dillon's in North Liberty, Indiana. And 78 was a tough season the year before, and my dad and I had been, it was a tough season. We raced for a championship out of Batesville, Arkansas, running ASA all up in the Midwest, a lot of travel. We managed to win the championship. It was a season where we had a little bit less product sponsor backing. And so it was, especially the engine program was a little bit of a drain. My dad was footing the bill for that. He was trying to run his trucking business. I was trying to run the race team. He was trying to run his race, run the trucking business. And he seemed like he was running a little wild. He was a little off track with his life. He was drinking quite a bit, and he was one of those guys that when he overindulged, he changed a good bit, and he had also married his third marriage, one of which I didn't particularly approve of. I just wasn't. He and I just had a little bit of a rub, and I was 19 years old, and I really did want to be my own man, and I wanted to make things work my own way, and I wanted to be my own boss, and so I thought it was an opportunity for me to move to Indiana and get out on my own. And so I did. And my dad was okay about it. He may have been a little bit bothered inside by the fact that, that I wanted to get out and get on my own. But at the same time, he had to be also proud of me because I wanted to, because I wanted to be my own man. And he had spent 19 years raising me to be a good man and someone who handles his own business and makes his own decisions. It was time for me to fly the coop. So he continued to come to some of the bigger pit stop races, the 300 and 400 lap races. He would come to those for sure. He'd usually bring Bill Davis along so Bill could gas the car, and because Bill Davis was working in the trucking company office with my dad there at my dad's place. So we continued to get along great. We got along good. We got along better because I didn't have to see, how he was living his life, and I could focus on what I was doing, and things really, really turned for the better. And I can't tell you what year it was, but it was a few years after this. I'm going to say mid 80s. And he went into a rehab center and, gave up alcohol and whatever drugs he might have been partaking in and everything. And he went in for a year in Searcy, Arkansas. And when he came out, he was, for the first time in his life, he was clean and sober. And he was my dad through and through. We, developed one hell of a relationship going forward. He's my hero, always was, before and after that, always growing up. Even when I didn't approve of the way he was living his life, he was my hero, and always will be my hero.
Speaking of another hero that you had from the racing side of things, question from @TailTank4 on Twitter. What's your fondest memory of Larry Phillips?
My fondest memory is he gave me my first job, other than washing trucks down at my dad's trucking company on Saturdays. And I only did that. I didn't get paid. I only did that because I got to drive them. I would take them around the block when I finished washing, instead of back them back in their spot. I'd take them around the block and back them in their spot. So Larry gave me my first job when I didn't deserve a job. I was racing against Larry every Friday and Saturday night in Springfield, Missouri, and Fort Smith, Arkansas. Larry had built us a dirt car in '76, late model. So we knew Larry well, and we raced against him all in the spring of '77. And when I graduated high school, I hit him up for a job. He had Larry Phillips Performance, whatever it was, that, built parts and sold parts and whatnot. He didn't have very many people working there. I recall, he gave me a job. I got an apartment for the summer of '77 and moved up there. Larry was one hell of a character, besides being a great race car driver. But he gave me a job when I didn't deserve one. I wasn't a fabricator. I remember the first day there, he walked me over to a workbench, threw up a upper A-frame jig on the thing, and said, "Build me some A-frames." And dude, I couldn't weld. My weld looked like, turkey shit or something. It was terrible. But I did it and learned, and I remember later on that summer when I was working there on Thursday before Friday night at Springfield on Thursday, his race car had been sitting there since Sunday, not touched. And he told me, he says, change gear in my car, get it ready to race you Friday night. So I worked on his car, changed the gear, and got stuff ready. And then, of course, my dad and Shaw brought up my race car, and we raced like hell that night. But yeah, I've got great memories. Larry was one hell of a character, funny guy.
Speaking of more memories, another Twitter question @T2 Volkman Todd. Todd Volkman asks, what are your favorite memories of fellow Ford racers, Davey and Alan? And that would be Davey Allison and Alan Kulwicki.
Well, Davey was Davey was really a good dude. His dad made him earn everything that he had in racing. He was the solid kind of guy that you would expect from Bobby and Judy. Just one heck of a fine young man and fine fella. Davey always treated me with tremendous respect, as did Bobby. And Davey and I shared a passion for race cars, and he had a passion for airplanes as well, just like Bobby did. And when I got my first airplane, the first race I took it to was Dover. And when the race was over at the airport, when we were getting ready to get in the plane, Davey come running over and said, "I want to see it, want to look at it." And he climbed up inside and sat down and checked it out because he loved airplanes. And I remember that. I just remember that like it was yesterday. It's amazing. Gosh, where did I start on Alan? There's a lot of stories on Alan. I wouldn't say that Alan and I had a love-hate relationship, but we had a fierce competitiveness and a reasonable friendship. I helped Alan a couple different ways. I know that when he was thinking about getting into NASCAR, I was already running full time in 1982, and Alan called me up and was asking me questions. I said, "Well, come on down to the Charlotte race, and you can stay at my house." And so Alan comes to Charlotte, stays at my house with me. Then the next morning, we're going to get up and go to the racetrack, and he's going to follow me out there in his rental car. And so he grabs the newspaper out in the driveway. And anybody that knows Alan will chuckle at this story. So he's taking the newspaper with him in the car, and we come to a traffic. It's a long drive through town, Charlotte, through town to the Speedway. We stop at a traffic light, and when it turns green, I take off, go across the intersection. I look back, Alan's still sitting in the road, ain't moved, reading the newspaper. Traffic's he's blocking the traffic, and I have to pull over and wait for him to come on and get across the intersection. And I don't know, that was just funny to me. It doesn't sound funny unless you know Alan, but Alan was he was the opposite of me. He was in granny low gear. I mean, he was a low gear kind of guy, but he was a thinker. And I'm a Tasmanian devil, bouncing off the wall, wide open, don't think about nothing, just do it kind of guy. And Alan was a thinker. He always thought everything through. He was so smart in that way, and he was very methodical. And Alan and I, like I said, we had a rivalry at times, and we had, but we had mutual respect and some friendship sprinkled along in there. So.
Going to a different subject now. Jake LaPointe asks at Jake LaPointe5, what was your favorite sponsor throughout your career?
All of them. They were all fantastic. I can't say one was my favorite. I mean, fans know me as the legendary number 6 Valvoline race car driver, but and Valvoline and I still have a relationship, and I still use their oil in all my vehicles. But
isn't it crazy after all these years and probably different ownerships and consolidations and things like that with Valvoline, you still maintain a relationship with them?
Yeah, it was really cool. We rekindled the relationship a couple years ago because in my racing endeavors, we transitioned to many motor oils through the years. I drove a Pennzoil car. I think a Quaker State car, and different things through the years. But a couple of years ago, we rekindled the relationship, did some legend promotions with Valvoline, and started pouring Valvoline at all of our 5 car dealerships and proudly pouring their oil. So, that's a legendary association that we had. But all my sponsors were fantastic to work with. I really enjoyed working with all of them. I really enjoyed working with the Army. What an amazing experience that was. But I had some great sponsors as well at Hendrick Motorsports, and through the years, the opportunity to work with AAA was fantastic. All jokes aside, working with Pfizer was fantastic with the Viagra brand, but mostly we did some really great work that I could really be proud of by promoting men's health and giving free health screenings to any fan that wanted to at all the racetracks. The first year that they were involved, they set up a mobile unit at the racetrack and encouraged any men, especially men over 40, to go get a checkup, free checkup. Because if you catch a health problem early, it's much easier to treat than if you do like most men do, which is keep grinding till you have a disaster. Sometimes it's much harder to treat those issues. So, I'm very, very fortunate through my years to work with a lot of great companies.
Speaking of that, now you had a number of paint schemes. I know you like certain looks. I know you do. We've talked about this in the podcast. You had a favorite paint scheme of all time?
Yeah, I think it was, I believe it was 97. The Valvoline car, the one where the instead of the straight and bent corners, it was sort of a ribbon. The V on the hood kind of came down the side, each side of the car like a ribbon. And that paint job, that paint scheme was my favorite. Just really, really a sexy looking race car.
All right. So going back to even more questions here on Twitter. Here's a real out there question from Jay Barker. Did you ever think about running a sprint car at any point in your career?
Never crossed my mind. I was a stock car driver from day one on dirt. And when I transitioned in my 4th season, I transitioned to pavement racing. I was done with dirt racing. The Daytona 500 was not on dirt. So, dirt fell off my radar screen, from a driving standpoint.
Going back to 1987, Haley Emery asked, and I believe we covered this, touched on it a little bit. In 1987, you ran one cup race for Roger Hamby. Do you have any memories of that experience?
Yeah, I do. I was running the full Busch schedule in the 31 car that you can go back to that episode and listen to all that stuff. It was a very, very hard working year. One of the physically most demanding years of my career. And whoever was driving Roger's car for, I think it was the Coke 600, wasn't able to, had qualified the car, but wasn't able to race. And they looked me up and asked me if I'd run it. And, in 1983, I would have just killed to have drove Roger's car. I really did want to drive for him back then. He was a mid-pack car, really good running, overperforming race car, underfunded, run a lot of used tires and a lot of stuff like that. But so it was not a contender kind of car, but it was a car that really overperformed, and many drivers drove his car as stepping stones, Lake Speed and Sterling Marlin and so many others. And so he came and got me and said, "Hey, you want to run my car?" And, it paid, and I was there. Hell yeah, I want to run it. And I don't recall if I practiced the car. I guess I surely got in the car on Saturday and took some laps in it. But it was it was a car that run used engine parts and used pretty much everything. And we got in a race, and I think the engine broke early. So And that's the story on that. It was just a fill-in situation, an opportunity to run an additional race. It wasn't an opportunity to, go out there and show anybody what I could do. Usually his equipment wasn't really that kind of equipment. It was an overperforming mid-pack time funded operation.
Going back to more memories, Doug Mallory asked on Twitter, which driver inspired you the most, that brought out your very best, and which driver was the thorn in your side during these racing years?
Oh gosh, that's a tough one on the thorn in my side. I would say Mike Eddy in ASA. We had very conflicting driving styles, and that all culminated in a crash trying to win the Dry Power 400, the Winchester 400 in 1980, which was all on me. It was my fault, my mistake. 5 laps to go, passing him for the win, trying to pass him for the win. But he was tough. He was a tough competitor, a good dude. Still love him. But he was the sort of the Dale Earnhardt of ASA from the standpoint of being able to really get tremendous results with his equipment, and was tenacious. In NASCAR, I didn't have a thorn in my side. If it was some overperforming drivers that were not as skilled. They caused wrecks. I didn't like drivers that caused wrecks. I just didn't. And some of the guys that didn't run or didn't make it all the way to the top were a little bit accident prone because they drove over their head. I didn't like that. I didn't like drivers that drove over their head. I didn't like drivers that wrecked, especially that took guys with them. Earnhardt was not a thorn in my side. He just was one hell of a competitor and would crush you and beat you with a slower car and make you feel like dirt. He did that to me a number of times. Later in my career, that didn't happen as often, but early in my career, he handed me my butt a number of times with a slower race car, which was really hard to take. As far as drivers that influenced me, I would say Trickle, Wayne Brooks, then Dick Trickle, then Darrell Waltrip, then Bobby Allison. Those guys were instrumental in molding the driver and the person that I became. Bobby and Darrell both were especially interested in me in different ways. Darrell Waltrip was an amazing man. He took interest in me. He was very interested in late model racing, even though he was winning NASCAR championships and stuff. Darrell never forgot where he came from. He continued to race short track cars and ASA and those kind of things. He saw me coming. We made a great friendship. In 1980, when I got my feet and ankles busted up, he came and drove my car for me. And I told him before he came we were going to break the track record and win the race. And I told him that not because I was optimistic, because I was positive that my car could do it and that I would do it if I wasn't hurt, and that he would do it in my car. And we did just that. Against all odds, we did it. And so all through the years, Darrell tried to help me. In the later years, we spent a lot of Bible studies together, and and time together in the motor coaches at the racetracks, like that. And Bobby was interested in me in a different kind of way. It seemed like Bobby was a big supporter of mine. One time when I was young, it was 1983. Bobby told me I was with him. I spent the week with him, and I was standing in his shop. And Bobby looked at me and he says, "You know what the worst thing about you is?" And I said, "No." "What?" He said, "Your mouth." And I had tried to. That really impacted me, and I still have a trash mouth, but I don't have a trash mouth like I did before. That had an impact on the way I spoke, and the words that I used. I was a product of my environment and didn't realize that not everybody spoke the way I spoke. I was 23 years old, and I needed to clean it up. So I did. Bobby was a good dude. He told Jack Roush in 1987 when Jack contacted him about driving his newly formed race car for 1988. He told him he wasn't interested, but that he should get Mark Martin to drive that. So Bobby had a hand in my making it to the NASCAR Hall of Fame for sure.
So speaking of that, that rolls into this next question from NASCAR Guy 1982. When and where was the first time you met Jack Roush?
I remember there used to have some charity benefit in Chicago, and I met him in 1985 at that because I was I was an ASA champion, and I got invited to it, and I went to that, and I met him after that thing was over with. I met with him for a little bit and got to talk to him, and that was the first time I met him. Was at that function, and was a charity raising event somewhere in Chicago. That was a long time ago.
We're going to roll to some short track questions. Of course, and you speak fondly of the short track days, but we've got some very, very pointed questions. And in fact, some of these have come through email over the last month. And as we've been doing these year podcasts by year, but I'm going to try to condense. This is a bunch of questions that come through before you guys exit the 80s and enter the 90s. Please have Mark mention how big of a deal it was during his short track career to win at places like the Minnesota State Fair, La Crosse Oktoberfest, Kaukauna, Milwaukee Mile, Winchester, Elko Speedway, the Dells, and etc.
That was cool. Minnesota Fair was cool. Oktoberfest, for some reason, was even cooler. I don't know why. I guess because it was just at the right time. It was 79. It was a place where you would expect Wisconsin racers like Trickle or Mike Miller or Tom Reffner or one of those guys to win. Was a true feather in my cap. Milwaukee Mile was okay, but didn't have the history. I didn't feel like that some of the others did. Winning the National Short Track Championship at Rockford, Illinois at 18 years old at that time was phenomenal. That was nobody could believe that a person that young could come and beat all those guys. Real super hot shoes of short track racing up there at Rockford. That was one of the top 5 biggest wins of my career. And I go through that in some of the podcasts, but winning the Arkansas State Championship 50 lapper in I-30 Speedway, Benton Speed Bowl back then, 1974, the first year I raced, was a Daytona 500 type event for us to win. Then winning at Bolivar in 76 in the late model dirt car was a Daytona 500 type event, milestone event. Then winning the National Short Track Championship at Rockford in 77 was certainly like winning the Daytona 500 or Indy 500 for us. It was unbelievable. To be real honest with you, those are the biggest wins of my career. And if it weren't for wins like those, no one would ever have seen me in NASCAR. So I view those as bigger. My career, the most important phase of my career is we've just done podcasts on. My first year, 74 through 1990. And as far as I'm concerned, everything after that is second, takes a back seat to what transpired leading up to that. That is the journey. And without that, there would have never been, a NASCAR Hall of Fame induction for me.
From the same email from Steven, he also asked, and I don't know if you will recall this, could you please ask Mark to detail his wreck at Madison?
So back then, ArtGo ran, their program was you qualified, they inverted 12. Well, this is 1980. My car's stupid faster than everybody else's. So I set fast time, started 12th, and they run this particular day. I think they were running twin 50s, inverting 12 each time. And I was hauling up through the pack, and I caught Jim Sauter, and Jim was going into 3, and I was coming fast. I got under him going into 3, and he pinched me. And, I didn't turn him around because that's not what you did back then. I turned myself around and slid to a stop at the bottom, and Bob Strait was right there. There was nothing he could do. T-bowed me right in the foot box. And as soon as we stopped, as soon as he hit me, it was I'm sitting there, I know, oh man, I just broke my feet. And I look up, and here comes Mike Miller. He parks his car, gets out of it, comes running. It's like it wasn't red flagged or nothing. Here comes Mike to check on me. I told him, man, my feet's broke. And that's that. I sit there, and they got me out, put me on a stretcher. They had called somehow or another, a military helicopter was in the area doing doing some kind of work. And so they helicoptered, they landed that military helicopter, and they loaded me onto the helicopter and flew me to Madison General. Landed on top of Madison General, I think on top. And took me in, and I waited for my surgery, and when my surgery's over with, and my doctor comes in to see me, he tells me about my injuries, and I tell him, I says, well, I'm going to race again in 30 days, so so have that in our plan. He says, you're not going to race again this year. I said, I'm going to race again in 30 days. And that was the end of our conversation about it. I found out that he was Eric and Beth Hayden's father, who were Olympic figure skaters. So he knew a little something about, sports and what it took to make it to the top. So we never had another discussion. he sent me away, sent me home. Had 3 weeks later, I come in for my checkup. He cuts the cast off of my foot, and I tell him, Doc, I got it all fixed. I got a hand clutch. I'm going to right foot gas and brake, and because my left foot was broken 4 places. And I'm going, I got a hand clutch. I'm going to right foot brake and gas. I'm all set, all good to go. I thought he was going to cut the cast off and put a new cast on. Well, he cut the cast off, said, stand up. And it scared the shit out of me. I said, what? He said, stand up. Stand up. Walk out of here. And I said, no, I got a hand clutch and everything. You can put a cast back on it. He says, no, it'll heal faster out of the cast. And I stood up and walked out of there. It was freaking unbelievable. Hurt like hell. But he sent me on my way. And then the story goes, that was the 30 days later, I guess the next week, I go to Milwaukee with a hand clutch in the car and right foot braking, which I'd never done in my life in a race car, and sat on the pole and won the race. I had an epic battle with Trickle at the end, multiple restarts, and he was just dogging the hell out of me. It was a major win. And then we went on to Cayuga for the weekend, and it was a 300 there, I think. And we sit on the pole and run second to Junior Hanley up there. And so we made a hell of a return in 30 days.
We're going to move to some setup questions. A lot of people are very interested in your setups and your knowledge of your race cars. So we have a question from Scooter Allison. He says, I love listening to this podcast. One of my favorite aspects is hearing Mark's setup info from different races and how he remembers percentages and spring rates from 30 to 40 years ago. As a setup question, what does spring split do when used versus using the same springs across the rear or front?
Hey, I have issues. I'm a real messed up person. And I can't remember flip. But especially when I was young, the most important thing in my life was making the fastest race car, winning race car. And I did I dreamed up the setups. I tried the setups. I put them in the car. I did it all as far as those setups go. I did all the dreaming up. I did all the studying. Every time I saw Darrell Waltrip, even when I got to NASCAR in 1982, I asked him, what springs you got? What springs you got? I mean, it's just, and I remember the percentages. I remember all those things from 77, 78, 79, 80, and even that far back. If you show me a picture of a car at a certain racetrack and I recognize what track it is, then I can recognize what race it is. And then my memory, it's just there. It's just like a setup sheet in my mind. It's weird. Spring split, there's no, I'm not smart enough to give you an answer. With the heavy left side weight cars, we fought loose all the time. The cars turned incredibly well. We're loose all the time. So we ran a lot of spring split in the rear, meaning the right rear had to be really soft and right rear and left rear had to be really stiff. And we ran paired up springs in the front during that era, heavy left, 60, 61, 62% left side weight era. But as we went forward, and they started taking left side weight away, and then they changed, they made a change and downsized the cars and shortened up the wheelbase. Those cars didn't turn as well, and we evolved from a pair of 400s in the front to a 350, 300 across the front, the 300 in the left front. For some reason, that softer left front probably just let the car feel a little softer, let it turn on the caster, front end caster setup that you had and everything. Just let it turn a little bit more. And we went from running like a 200 left rear and a 125 right rear to a pair of 175s. That was just to get it to turn better. And those are just the kinds of things you do. I mean, we got into NASCAR. We ran equal front and rear springs in '88. Cars were really fast, but fell off the tires. Then in '89, we got to splitting the springs up like everybody else, running like a 1800 and a 1200 across the front, 1.8" bar and a 400 in the right rear and a 350 in the left rear, 10.5, 11.5 track bar. That setup would stay on the tires longer and was, but that wasn't anything new. That was copying everybody else, what everybody else ran at the time. So a lot of people ran most people ran 1400s in the left front instead of a 12 with the 18 in the right on the 1.5 miles and stuff. I always liked the softer left front for some reason. I felt like my car drove better. They said the bigger left front turned better. I did not find that. I never saw the car turn better with the bigger left front. So I never was big from 1989 on. I never liked a big left front spring in a car. Rusty, most everybody ran, 20% more left front spring than I did all through those years.
Another question from Brandon Whedon. I've seen lots of pictures from the 80s and 90s, and the spoilers seem to be almost completely laid down. Can you explain the pros and cons of that and what the rules were regarding that?
There wasn't any rear spoiler rule at the time, and that you're seeing that basically at Daytona and Talladega. And it's right after restrictor plates. So you go from 650 to 700 horsepower down to 400. And so drag became an issue. Drag was not an issue at 700 horsepower around Daytona. It wasn't a big issue because you still had to handle, because you had so much power, you could make so much speed. So you put more spoiler on it for more downforce so you could handle through the turns. When they choked off the motors, you could run wide open easy. And so as you would push the spoiler back, you would take downforce off the car, but you would take considerable drag off the car. And so you would pick up speed. It would get a little bit harder to handle in the turns, but it was all in your hands. The driver could tell the team, I'm going to have more spoiler for tomorrow, or let's leave it laid back. Or during a race, you could do a pit stop and they'd run back there and knock it up, bend it up a little bit. It was a cool time when the cars made, let's say 400 horsepower, 400, somewhere around there, and Daytona and Talladega, and you just you needed that speed more than you needed the stick. You see a little bit of that in today's rules package when they talk about the downforce in the cars at the intermediate tracks, because they're down at 450 horsepower, or at 500 horsepower, I guess it is. And at 500 horsepower at Charlotte, for example, if you put maximum downforce on the car and a lot of drag, it takes enough speed out of the car that a lot of teams put a midways compromise and take a bunch of that downforce off and pick up the speed, and then they just fight it more, getting it through the turns. And it all comes down to who has the best mechanical setup. If you've got a mechanical setup that really works good, you can take downforce off the car and make more straightaway speed and still not give up a lot of handling. So at the end of the day, the cars still have the greatest advantage that have the best handling, because they can get by with best handling from a mechanical standpoint, because you can get by with a little less downforce, a little less drag. For some reason, I don't remember. For some reason, 1260, 1262, something like that. I don't remember for sure. But for some reason, that number sticks out in my head from qualifying time. A 350, 300, pair of 175s in the back, 350 in the right front, 300 left front, inch and 3/8 hollow front bar, 2 o'clock Panhard bar, so pretty high Panhard bar, 56% cross, probably 2 spool in the rear, and probably somewhere between 2 1/4 and 2.5 inches of rear stagger, somewhere in that range. Whatever left side weight the rule was, probably around 56%, something like that. And 51% rear weight, between 50.5 and 51% rear weight. Those are the high points of that setup. That would have been, it was probably 86 that we won the 300 there. Might have been 85. But that setup kind of coincides with that Ford that I had there, Gunderman Ford. But every year that I went there, the pole was in the high 12s. And first time I took Dillon car there, we ran a pair of 500s and a 200 and a 150 across the back, 200 in the left, 150 across the back. But that car had more like 60% left side weight, 62% probably left side weight. So ran a bunch of different setups, ran conventional coils there in 77, 78, and 79. Then run the coilovers in 80 and beyond.
So we're going to stay on the theme of specific products as you're talking. And Curtis Vanderwall has a question in email. He says, Mr. Martin, it seems as though throughout your NASCAR career, you had a great relationship with Simpson Race Products and used them exclusively. Can you talk a little about that relationship and why you choose to use their products?
Bill Simpson. I mean, if you do your history on Bill Simpson or you read his book, you find out what kind of character he was as a person, as a race car driver, and involving into the safety field as a necessity. Being a race car driver necessitated him to get into the safety field because there was so much room for improvement in those years. So I'm a big supporter of Bill Simpson personally, and Simpson Racing Products and the things that he did and the things he developed. And then going forward, Butch Stevens taking over, I think, Simpson Products. Butch was a friend of mine, and he was my spotter in the early years at Roush's. He actually spotted for me. So he's a good dude.
Another product question coming in from Steve on email. Please have Mark talk about his history of using Dixiana racing seats. While everyone was using Brian Butler seats and others, he always had the old style short track type seat.
Yeah, so I got to using Dixiana seats after I got out of the fiberglass seats. First it was a fiberglass seat that looked similar to a Butler seat with no supports on them. You used to buy them from Ed Howe, fiberglass seats. And so Dixiana started making them out of 1/8 inch aluminum, no braces on them, just bent up 1/8 inch aluminum. And I raced in those things. You'd hit something, and I thought it was the right thing to do because I thought it didn't break your ribs and stuff. The rib support in the Dixiana seat would just open right up. It would just bend and open right up. I thought that was a good thing at the time coming up through the years. So when that was up through my ASA days, and then when I got into NASCAR, I continued to use the same seat I'd been driving in because I was used to it. And so I was going to Daytona and Talladega with 1/8-inch bent up aluminum seat. We started adding a little bit of bracing to them through the years because they were getting where they bent too easy, but we didn't ever get them really stiff. And I stayed in those things until, I don't even know when I finally made the switch to Butler. But when I did, they really were so comfortable. God, I had those seats right. And then, and so I stayed in those seats until I got with Hendrick, and Hendrick was the manufacturer of all those carbon seats. And I didn't want to, in the worst way. I did not want to use a carbon seat, but it was the right thing to do because I was a Hendrick driver, and all the Hendrick guys, ran them. They gave me the option, but I would have been an ass to not do it. So they had to make a new seat for me. They didn't have one small enough for me, so they had to do a new mold for a seat small enough for me, and they wound up using that for Kelly Byers, and Danica wound up using that as well. A few others, but not many people small enough from the butt up. I've got really long legs for a short dude, but it's real easy for me to get my head in my ass because it don't have far to go.
Another question from David Weichert on email. He says, we just had the second Roval race last weekend, which in my opinion was great to watch. As someone who has had success at Charlotte Motor Speedway and on the road courses, what is your thoughts on this as a fan? And how do you feel if it had been on the schedule when you were driving?
Well, I loved racing on road courses. I think that the schedule could stand more. I love watching this Roval race. Seemed like there was a lot of passing to me this past race. Seemed fun, seemed good. As a driver, it's not important what I think or what I would thought or whatever, because I'm not anymore. I'm a fan, just like the rest of you guys. And I thought it was awesome. Loved it. A lot of action. Great race. And I applaud them. I was somewhat disappointed that we lost a race off the oval at Charlotte, because I think it's one of the greatest races on our schedule, racetracks on our schedule, and I loved it. But we still have the 600, and oval track racing's not going away, and we needed more road courses, and that was the only way we could get a road course, is to take one away, take an oval away. So I'm good with it.
Last question for this fan podcast for the episode. Haas Cartwright on Twitter asks, where do you see the health of short track racing, and where can improvements be made?
I think short track racing is on an upswing right now. Asphalt racing is not really on an upstream. Maybe it is on an upswing, but it's not very healthy right now. Whereas dirt track racing is pretty healthy and on an upswing, and things really look optimistic. Pavement racing is just a challenge. It's just a challenge right now, and there's not any great answers. Both dirt and asphalt need uniform rules, which dirt have for the late model dirt cars. They have a good set of rules that seem to be pretty universal, and that's really fantastic. You need to get away from, on pavement racing, you need to get away from $50,000 engines. And you need uniform rules. That's where I see the fragmented rules. Late models, crate late models, all different rules, modified asphalt, all these different things. You need affordable, good series that you can take a car and run from East Coast to West Coast. Anywhere you want to race it, it'll be competitive because the rules are close enough to the same that you can take it and run. We need that in multiple divisions for pavement racing. The modifieds on dirt are doing well. Personally, I would still like to see the UMP rules and the other rules. I'd like to see those guys get together, because I just think that, like when we had the Race for Hope in Batesville, and we had the IMCA mod rules, a lot of the UMP guys didn't come and run, and because the rules are enough different that they didn't feel like their cars, it wasn't worth it to them. And there are so many IMCA modifieds and UMP modifieds in this country. If they were all if they could all agree on a compromise for rules for everything from tires to engines to whatever the frame difference, any difference there is, body, whatever, then one guy could take his car and run anywhere in the United States and know that his car was on the money. That would be good. That's the biggest thing, is controlling the cost. And that's why dirt modifieds are so popular, because the costs are contained really well in that division. And we need that on pavement. We need a racing organization or a racing series kind of car rules package that runs all over the country that is the same rules.
So that'll do it for episode number 32 of the Mark Martin Podcast. Again, hit us up on the website, markmartinpod.com or markmartinpod.com. Make sure to subscribe on your favorite podcast player and leave us that 5-star rating.
Thank you for subscribing and listening to the Mark Martin Podcast. Remember to give us a 5-star rating in your app store. Connect with us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at Mark Martin POD. The Mark Martin Podcast is a production of the Accelerated Podcast Network.